Our message to Moscow from Liverpool today is this. President Putin, you will not win. Stop the killing, start the talks, agree a peace. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
That is Haley, UK Defense Minister. We will support Ukraine as long as it takes. Well, we've heard this over and over again. This is not new. Those of you who started following this war from day one, we've heard this a million times, and yet nothing is changing. The fact is, if European Union and NATO should give every weapon they have on earth here to the Ukrainians, it's still not going to change anything on the battlefield. The fact is, Ukraine currently lacks manpower. That is their main problem. By the way, let's go to the main topic of the day, which is Russia oil refineries. So, if you observe this war right from 2022, between November to December, the Russians always target Ukrainian electrical infrastructures. Well, Volodymyr Zelensky recently said if the Russians target Ukraine electrical infrastructure, they are also going to target Russian refineries. By the way, Zelensky was not bluffing. The Ukrainians actually started, or they've already started targeting Russian oil refineries. Now, the Russians have also come up with some countermeasures. Check this out. Well, this is a new strategy that the Russians have adopted. Those of you who are confused what is happening here, so the Ukrainians continue to target Russian oil refineries with UAVs, drones. So the Russians are now covering up their oil refineries with nets to prevent these drone attacks. Although most of these oil refinery critical components are underground, but not everything can be underground. So the ones which are in open space, the Ukrainians are targeting them, right? I believe most of you've come across this. The Western mainstream media continue to claim that the Russians are running out of fuel. There are long queues in Russia. I mean, the Ukrainians are destroying the Russian economy. I know, you guys, you've definitely come across this news on the mainstream media. But what if I told you that this is absolutely false? There is no shortage of fuel in Russia because of Ukrainian strikes. No. Don't take this from me. If you know anybody in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or in Russia, ask them if there's any shortage of fuel in Russia. I am currently doing everything on my own. If you wish to support what I do here with airtime or Momo, I will leave my number in the description. Let's continue. This whole Russian oil shortage, it is pure propaganda. Let me help you understand what is actually happening. So this is happening very close to Alaska. So the villages and towns that are closer to Alaska, they have this oil shortage problem long before this war even started. When it's time for farming, or when farmers are taking out their produce, or when they are harvesting, at that time there is always high demand for fuel. And when you look at this area, they have problem with their refineries. So this oil shortage thing happened long before even this war started. It is a problem that is already existing. It has got nothing to do with Ukraine striking Russian oil refineries. Now, the funny thing is, most of these oil refineries and this pipeline that the Ukrainians are actually targeting are pipelines that is connecting to the West. The West continue to buy billions of dollars of oil and gas from the Russians. So it is rather going to affect the Western Europeans more than the Russians. Look at the oil deal between the Russians and Chinese. This is happening far from the front lines. Around Siberia. I reported that particular story here on this same platform. Now today the Sunday Times posted something about Western Europeans still buying a lot of oil and gas from the Russians. So, in reality, it is rather the West who is actually funding the war in Ukraine, because they continue to give billions and billions of dollars to the Russians, whilst they are out criticizing the Chinese, criticizing India. But in reality, they are still buying a lot of oil from the Russians. Let me read this from the Sunday Times. Now, this is what they reported. They said, I'm going to summarize the whole thing, right? In its efforts to support Ukraine, Europe has sent money, tanks, drones, missiles, and more. But what if I told you that 3.5 years into this war, the countries of EU are still paying 1 billion a month into Russian war effort? When you observe the whole thing critically, it will be very difficult for Western Europeans to decouple completely from Russian oil. It is almost impossible for any country to replace what the Russians are currently doing for Western Europeans, because their LNG, one, is quality, their oil is quality, number two, it is cheaper. So after the Americans blew up Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1, they wanted to replace Russia. They wanted to export this LNG and oil to Western Europeans. But it became a big challenge for Western Europeans because it was very expensive, very, very expensive. And some of these Western country leaders were not happy with, how the Americans were treating them, because they believed that they were allies, and in these difficult times, America was supposed to actually help them, give them cheaper oil and gas. But the Americans refused to do so. So most of these Western European countries are left with no option than to still continue buying this LNG from the Russians. And why don't they just humble themselves? By the way, let's continue. I am talking, of course, about energy. A Russian export that is still many months after December 2022 oil embargo being snapped up by some European nations. This has not gone unnoticed by President Trump. They are funding the war against themselves, he told UN last week. So the fact is, whilst Western Europeans continue to criticize other countries, the fact is they are giving Russia 1 billion euros every month. That is why many experts call it pure hypocrisy. You know how we do it. I am going to give you guys most of the update in this video. If you are new to the channel, subscribe, and to our regular viewers, please, one of the best ways to support this channel is to hit on the like button. And let me know what you think about this whole incident in the comment section. By the way, let's go to the next topic. Well, the Venezuela situation you think is over? Well, things are getting tensed in Venezuela. So this is what Slav posted this morning. They said, top Trump aides push for ousting Maduro from power in Venezuela. Now, the latest information coming out from Venezuela is the Trump administration is trying to get rid of Maduro. They want to kick him out of power. Let's read this. Top Trump aides push for ousting Maduro from power in Venezuela, according to the New York Times. The push by top aides to President Trump to remove Nicolas Maduro as the leader of Venezuela has intensified in recent days, with administration officials discussing a broad campaign that will escalate military pressure to try to force him out, U.S. official says. Note, this was posted by the New York Times. It is being led by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Mr. Rubio argued that Mr. Maduro is an illegitimate leader who oversees the export of drugs to the United States, which he says poses an imminent threat. In recent weeks, the U.S. military has launched lethal attacks on civilian boats that the administration said were smuggling drugs for Venezuela gangs. But Mr. Rubio is sharpening a more aggressive strategy using intelligence provided by CIA, the official said. Okay, the Pentagon has built up to a force of more than 6,500 troops in the region. What is the problem here? I believe this has got nothing to do with Venezuela president. The fact is they want to control the oil market. That is a fact. They are trying to use a strategy which they used back in the Cold War era. One of the main reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed was because of economic hardships. The United States took control of the oil market, and we all know that the major export of the Soviet Union was oil and gas. So they decided to push the Saudis back in the 80s and 90s to reduce oil price, and oil became cheaper, and eventually the Soviet Union economy crashed. I believe that they are trying to use the same strategy here. We all know that Venezuela is one of the highest producer of oil, but full of sanctions. If they are able to take control of the oil market, meaning Russia war machine will be crippled. That is the fact, because Russia rely heavily on LNG and oil. America is preparing for war against China. So after the Chinese display their military might to the whole world, Uncle Sam just can't get over it. Day in, day out, they continue to talk about China. Now, they want to increase their production to face the Chinese. Now, the question is, how did we get here? America is running low on ammo. I've reported this countless number of times since 2020. I started reporting this since 2022. I kept telling you guys that when it comes to production, America is currently lacking behind. The Russians are outproducing them completely. What actually happened was the Ukrainians were demanding for more weapons at the peak of the war, and NATO couldn't meet the demands of the Ukrainians. So what actually happened was Uncle Sam and their allies decided to give weapons that were meant to protect their own countries. They gave it to Ukraine, and now they are now in a very vulnerable spot, and they are trying to replace these weapons. Let's go into the details of the story. The Pentagon is in panic. The US demand multiple increase in missile production for a war with China. In Washington, alarming sentiments are growing. The Pentagon, realizing critically low stock of precision weapons, where they've given all to Ukraine, HIMARS, has demanded from the largest American defense companies, Lockheed Martin and the rest, Boeing, even new players like Odoril Industries, to immediately increase missile production by 2 or 4 times. I hope you guys now believe me when I told you guys that America was running low on weapons. If America should even give every weapon they have on earth here to the Ukrainians, it's not going to change the course of this war. How did we get here? The fact is, the Russians' military-industrial complex is completely different from the Americans. Now, most of these companies I just mentioned here are owned by private entities, and they only operate when they are given contract. And that is why Uncle Sam is always in war all over the world. Because these big companies, they profit from wars. Note, they are owned by private entities. And if they don't sell weapons, they don't make money. When it comes to the Russians, it is completely different. I've told you guys multiple times that the Russian military-industrial complex belongs to the state. Now, one of the main reasons why Germany was able to inflict these heavy casualties on the Russians was because when the Germans invaded the Russians were not prepared. Stalin was not prepared. Their economy was not prepared. So they promised never to allow this amount of casualties to ever happen to them again. So the Russians always produce most of their, spare parts ahead of time. Now, according to experts, in time of war, if the Russians want to assemble 1,000 tanks in a day, they can do so because they build the parts. So in times of war, what the Russians do is they just assemble them. That is why at the peak of the war, when the mainstream media were saying that the Russians were running out of ammo, I told you guys that this is completely false. It is completely funny to me. It will be very difficult for these guys to run out of weapons. Never. They have a lot of weapons. Don't believe in what I'm telling you. Make your own research. According to experts, the Russians can fight for the next 10 years without any external support. That is why the Russians continue to fight, despite all the prediction about the collapse of their army or them running out of ammo. Well, they are not running out of ammo. The fact is, they are even outproducing NATO. Professor John Mesherman needs no introduction again if you watch my video. So he continued to spread the gospel truth. According to him, in a recent interview he granted, he said when he observed the whole situation critically, the whole war is going to end on the battlefield. So the battlefield is definitely going to determine the terms and conditions of this war. And this is also a confirmation to what I've been telling you guys in recent days, that when I look at the whole thing, the Russians realize that the West is not ready for peace, so they are going to end the war in their own terms. Well, let's watch him.
The possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is simply unacceptable to the Russians. It is an existential threat. And they are not going to stop until Ukraine and the West are defeated and they both accept the fact that Ukraine has to be a neutral state, number one, and it has to be disarmed to the point where it's not an offensive threat to Russia. And until you get to that point, or until you accept that point in the West, all this talk about generous terms makes no sense at all. So Rubio is, he's like a ship passing in the night with the Russians. They just, these are two sets of people who are just operating on very different planets. The Russians have demands that Rubio is simply unwilling to meet. And given that, the war is going to be settled on the battlefield, period. End of story.
Tell me that Professor John Meshama is not making sense. The only condition for this war to end is for Ukraine to stay neutral. Maybe you don't like how the world operates or how the world works, but the fact is, no superpower wants another superpower weapons on their borders. That is why America went to every length to prevent the Soviets, from putting their weapons in Cuba under Fidel Castro. So if America wouldn't accept this, why would the Russians accept that? It's simple. This is just a matter of common sense. And I don't know how this is difficult for any rational human being to understand. I don't get it. By the way, thank you very much for watching this video. If you watch this video to the very end, please let me know where you are watching this video from. Which country are you watching this video from? Let me know down in the comment section. This will help me understand or know the number of people who watch this video till the very end. Thank you very much for watching this video once again. Shalom. See you guys in the next episode.